Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning back into Acid Horizon. Today on the show, we have Ross Wolfe to discuss a series of essays he has written about, or against, the work of Domenico Losurdo and his particular brand of neo-Stalinism. This particular discussion includes a somewhat offline conversation. Well, in any case, it's available to our patrons on Patreon. So if you have been meaning to subscribe to Acid Horizon, now is a great time to do so. And of course, if you are already subscribed, thank you very much. Another one of the ways that many of you have continued to support us is through the Acid Horizon Research Commons. We had a great time in Grafton Tanner's first two classes, The Politics of Nostalgia, and we have another course starting October 8th with Jeremy R. Smith on the non-philosophy of Laruelle. This is a fantastic course for anyone wanting to do a deep dive on the work of Laruelle and get a grip on the concept of non-philosophy at a price that's easy on the wallet and that puts you right in front of one of the world's leading experts on the work of Francois Laruelle. All of the relevant links are below, and be sure to head to Patreon afterwards to catch the rest of this discussion. Okay, let's introduce Ross Wolfe.
Welcome to Acid Horizon, the Theory Podcast. Today, we're going to be tackling the questions of Western Marxism and its afterlives, and indeed the theoretical and political controversy over the term itself, who is included within the idea of a Western Marxism and its relations to actually existing socialism in contemporary states, such as China and Cuba, as well as the historical Soviet Union. And for this, we're going to actually taking a look at the work, a critical look, I must say, at the work of Domenico Losurdo, who is known for such works as Nietzsche, The Aristocratic Revel, Liberalism, Stalin, a critique of a black legend, and let's be honest, if you're in the sort of the Marxist theory sphere, a lot of ink has been spilled on this particular topic. But today, actually, we are very lucky to have with us Comrade Ross Wolfe, who has just written a 3-part series for a New International magazine, of which it's I'm always going to promote International, not just because I'm technically the UK editor, although I'm not necessarily good at that position, but it is a selection of texts looking at Domenico Losurdo's stranded methodology, his characterization of Western Marxism, its limits, and indeed the question of Stalinism as it arises in Marxist theoretical discourse and indeed in Marxist movements generally. Ross, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So can we just get into the question of what is Western Marxism? It's a term which you can make a lot of immediate associations due to both geopolitics and geography, as well as certain theoretical traditions. What do Marxist critics like someone like Losurdo mean when they talk about something like Western Marxism specifically?
Yeah, so Western Marxism has an interesting history. The term originated in the 1920s, but it was used rather sparsely. And interestingly, it was used even critically by many of the figures who would later be identified as Western Marxists. So figures like Karl Korsch kind of dismissed it as a kind of a nonsense. But the way that it really came to be used, especially made famous in an article by the French phenomenologist Merleau-Ponty, was that it referred to this group of Hegelian Marxists, mostly writing in German, in the early 20s. These figures like Georg Lukács, Karl Korsch, and a couple of Lukács's Hungarian comrades were denounced by Grigory Zinoviev at the Fifth Comintern. So this term, Western Marxism, then was taken up by a series of different New Left journals and journals that exerted a lot of influence along the New Left. And really, I would contend that what we think of as Western Marxism properly dates from this period of publishing, translating various works by non-Soviet Marxists, mostly operating in continental Europe, so in places like France, Germany, and Italy in the 60s and 70s. And this was more or less crystallized in a kind of balance. Well, there was actually an earlier one by Dick Howard, which is like a selection of texts, European Marxism since Lenin. But the way that people usually think about it dates from Perry Anderson's critical accounting of it in his book Considerations on Western Marxism from 1976. And the way that he understood it was basically as a product of defeat, the defeat of revolution in the West. But I would contend that within that sort of umbrella term of Western Marxism, it housed a number of different strains and tendencies that kind of sat uneasily with one another. So structuralist Marxism a la Althusser, which is quite different from and at odds with the Hegelian Marxism of the Frankfurt School. There were different strands of anti-Hegelianism in Italy, figures like Della Volpe and Coletti. But for Anderson, because these were more or less different Marxists in the West whom New Left Review had looked to for inspiration, he sort of created an amalgam out of it and tried to justify it as kind of a reaction to the failure of revolution in the West. Another figure whose book I think is, if you had to read one book on Western Marxism, he was at the time an editor of Telos, a figure named Russell Jacoby. He wrote a book called Dialectic of Defeat. And he, more like Merleau-Ponty, kind of defined Western Marxism more narrowly as just a collection of Hegelian Marxists. He also, like Anderson, saw it as kind of a product of defeat and an effort to think through that defeat critically. But I think his use of the category is much more coherent because he doesn't include within it figures like Althusser. He also adds figures like Henri Lefebvre and Guy Debord. But I mean, fast forward 40 years, and this figure, Domenico Losurdo, who's the subject of my trilogy, again took up this category in a much more negative sense. So whereas Anderson was kind of ambivalent about it, he was impressed with some of the theoretical innovations of Western Marxism, but thought it was limited practically because it was so divorced from the workers' movement. Jacoby really had a very positive evaluation of Western Marxism. He thought that it presented a sort of promising path not taken. Losurdo is overwhelmingly negative. And I think that owes to his veneration of the success, what he considers the successes of actually existing socialism. And he sees the criticisms that were leveled by the so-called Western Marxists in the West, which includes a huge range of categories, even wider variety of categories, including non-Marxists than Anderson had in his book from 1976. And for him, like the way that the uniting principle behind Western Marxism, the thing that kind of ties them all together, is basically that they weren't paying attention to the difficulties that actually existing socialism faced in being encircled by imperialist powers, and they didn't pay enough attention to the anti-colonial revolts that were breaking out along the periphery of capitalism.
No, thank you for clarifying on that point. I mean, in terms of the difficulties, I mean, it's a pretty wide net to cast about who or who wasn't attentive to colonial struggles. I mean, of course, Sartre had his introduction to the Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. If you want to take Sartre as a kind of a paradigmatic Western Marxist, drawing from a Hegelian tradition. Of course, he also ended up being to some extent a Zionist, which is why Josie Fanon wanted the preface taken out of later editions.
Sure.
But at the same time, I'm wondering how all those Czechoslovakian guns got into Palestine in 1848. I'm assuming, I mean, that's also a problem for actually existing socialism. I mean, what is it in particular that Losurdo thinks that is being ignored by I guess the general tendency of Western Marxists in terms of their analysis of imperialism? Is it just that they don't have a sort of sympathy for something like the Soviet bloc's sort of drastic demands? I understand the position to the extent that, you know, we're not in the Politburo making decisions. There's a lot of competing elements and they're being mediated there. And it might be saying that it's easy for you to stand back in your armchair and critique. You know, I mean, it's not like, you know, Marx never did that, of course. But I mean, what is particularly the main contention here? What is the conception of imperialism that Losurdo thinks other Marxists are missing?
Yeah, so for Losurdo, basically the primary contradiction, and this is a term that is borrowed, of course, from Mao, the Hauptwiderspruch, or like the fundamental antagonism of the age, is imperialism. And for him, that actually displaces the sort of foundational antinomy of capitalism, which for Marx, of course, is wage labor and capital. So for For Losurdo, the history of the 20th century and into the 21st century, rather than being the struggle of socialism against capitalism, ends up being the struggle of anti-colonialism against colonialism. And of course, obviously, Marx and Marxists have always been critical of and sought to overturn colonialism. And frankly speaking, a number of the figures that impugns as insufficiently anti-colonial Sartre is like Exhibit A. I cannot imagine a figure who is more vocally anti-colonial, especially as regards the French colonization of Algeria and their repression of the national liberation movement there. Yes, it's true. Obviously, like he and other figures, Marcuse had a Zionist streak at this kind of blind spot. And ironically, they considered it to be a kind of national liberation movement in its own regard, as did Stalin in 1948, which is what led to Israel's successful independence war. Like they would not have won the War of Independence without financial military backing from the USSR. But to return to criticisms of the different Western Marxists, he thinks, like, basically for him, class struggle exists in the plural. And he wrote this other book called Class Struggle. And for him, labor and capital is just one of three main sites of antagonism within capitalism. The other one occurs within the domestic sphere, of course, the patriarchy of women struggling against their domestic slavery. There's also the national struggle, which is the one that he sees as kind of like the most fundamental one. And for him, really, he believes that the sort of focus on labor versus capital, especially by figures, some of his own compatriots, figures like Mario Tronti, he thinks that blinds them to the bigger issue of anti-colonialism versus colonialism. One could perhaps claim that some of them minimize it or don't pay sufficient attention. Like, I'm willing to grant that to some extent. Especially with regard to the early Frankfurt School, that really is not the case at all. And he is kind of forced to concede that somewhat. He just claims that they turned away from it. But I mean, it really is very far-fetched to consider Sartre or this Italian Trotskyist, Sebastiano Timpanaro, to be some sort of colonial shills or like people who are insensitive to the struggle against, Western chauvinism, Western militarism. But I would argue that this is all kind of a piece of his own sort of Stalino-Dengist politics. If he perhaps considers the Western Marxists as like resting on their laurels, safe in their university chairs, criticizing the glory of Eastern Marxism or actually existing socialism, I would contend that he, a fellow professor, and some of his followers, figures his main promoter in the English-speaking world, Gabriel Rockhill, who are also professors, I don't really see them as doing much politically either. For them, the main task is just to verbally support these developmentalist regimes in the third world or places like China, where an anti-colonial revolt was staged, and they're currently in the process of, in their opinion, overtaking the West and displacing the United States as the global hegemon. So, I mean, it's largely, I would say, a reflection of his own politics. But along the way, I try to bear this out in my examination of his engagement, if you want to call it that, with the various figures. He's quite disingenuous, I think, with a lot of his readings, interpretations, and construals of what who he calls Western Marxists were saying.
And in terms of the way that Losurdo, as you're saying, is depicting these so-called Western Marxists, as you said, for him, the national liberation contradiction, the national antagonism is so central for his work. I mean, if we'll talk about his methods, and I mean method in not only a sense of analysis in terms of discovering and uniting and synthesizing concepts, but also synthesizing a historical narrative. I mean, it reminds me a lot of other discussions we've had on this podcast recently. So for listeners who haven't, check out our episode of Alex Stoffel on Eros and Empire, which is about methodological nationalism and how it split different liberation movements up for sexual liberation in the United States. Is there a kind of methodological nationalism to Losurdo's approach here? And if so, how does that factor into his wider method, which, I think the gloves have been somewhat off so far, but as you call it, I mean, it's, it's a school of falsification. It's essentially Stalinist, and I guess we'll also unpack what that means. But if I want to give a rudimentary definition right now, it's somewhat of a cheerleading. I mean, yes, it's easy for someone to criticize from all the way over in Paris or in Rome, but if everyone like to look Google a man called David Ryazanov at the Marx Engels Lenin Institute, you could probably find out what happens if you tried doing what Karl Korsch did in Moscow in the middle of the 30s.
Sure. I mean, yeah, those who remained did not fare well. Isaac Rabin, same story, who was Ryazanov's, one of his workers at the Marx Engels Institute. Yeah, I mean, the way that I define Stalinism, and I have seen that some have taken exception to my sort of broad use of it. I think that it is consistent with Trotskyist sort of descriptions of Stalinism, also left communist, probably the tradition that I'm most historically sympathetic to, but also like as it was used by the various critical theorists who had certain elective affinities with council communism and so on. Stalinism, as I understand it, it's a kind of adaptation to defeat, sort of ex post facto justification of the course that history has taken, such that it could never have happened any other way. And in fact, the predictions of even figures who are seen as foundational to them, like Marx, Engels, and Lenin, if their expectations that the state would wither away or that revolution would break out in the most advanced capitalist countries did not come to pass, then it was always doomed to fail. And in fact, we have to revise their theories to fit the mold of the present state of affairs. There is a component of methodological nationalism, certainly, to Stalin and Stalinism, and hence neo-Stalinists such as Losurdo. The way that I would characterize that is that they see not just socialism, but also capitalism as sort of existing on a sort of nation by nation basis, such that the effort to overcome socialism to sort of create post-capitalist relations can be hemmed in within the borders of an actually existing polity. When in fact, I think, according to Marx, according to Engels, Lenin, and all the Marxists that I look to as kind of exemplary, they conceived of capitalism as a global system. You can't overcome it within the bounds of any single state. Of course, there are worker states that can be encircled, and that has happened, of course, throughout history. The example of the Paris Commune, the USSR after 1923 come to mind. But still, because they conceive of capitalism and hence socialism, the effort to overcome capitalism on a country-by-country basis, they believe that socialism can be built within the boundaries of a single country. And hence they feel that the task of Marxists, especially outside of these actually existing socialist polities, is simply to cheer them on, to lend them their verbal support, and to counter the libelous accusation of critics of these regimes to say that, no, in fact, China maintains revolutionary continuity with 1949, 1917, all the way back to 1871 and 1848, as if, the intervening years and all the sort of attendant regressions that attach to it did not take place.
Yes, I think the question of socialism in one country, especially as it's put forward by Losurdo, edges right up against, I think, the real political stakes of taking Losurdo seriously, because what I see him doing is pivoting from the priority towards the universality of proletarian struggle to this kind of revanchist, national independence, state sovereignty model, even evoking a certain image of the fantasy. And as we see in current iterations of what we might call neo-Stalinism today, all of those tropes are there. And for Acid Horizon, some of our perennial targets are various folks from media outlets who've called themselves Marxists and then have cozied up to conservative or far-right think tanks in Europe, which also push the very same line: state sovereignty, reviving the family as antidotes to the excesses of liberal democracy, which, of course, I believe will have the consequence of completely demolishing any concept of democracy in the end anyway. And so I'm actually going to go right for the gusto here and ask, do you see parallels between these neo-Stalinist moves and what the far right is doing here today? And do you think that Losurdo as a figure plays into any of that?
So that's an interesting question. And I would say probably that there are fissures within neo-Stalinism itself. You see the kind of more social patriotism or the Patsoc patriotic socialism of a group like the ACP, the MAGA communists, as they termed themselves, and more third worldist variants. But there is, especially between the kind of Losurdo position and the patriotic socialism of like Ahaz al-Din and like all these other figures, an emphasis on China. There is an extent to which far right figures do. I mean, I've noticed this among white nationalists. They look to North Korea as the best Korea, as the meme goes, mostly because it has very strongly closed borders. It's ethnically homogenous, and they're not allergic to the kind of authoritarianism of the Kim family. Like they view that as perfectly legitimate. So I've seen far right figures like actually lionize North Korea as preferable to because the other big thing that, of course, right wingers in Europe and the United States are obsessing over is like demographic collapse and whatnot. So they look to the cratering birth rates in South Korea as like spelling doom, and they see that in Japan as well. And they see kind of the Stalinist, they would probably view Stalin as, especially with this reversal of the early Bolshevik efforts to liberalize the family, to make divorce just like a mutual consent, to legalize abortion, decriminalize homosexuality. They view that, and Stalin's kind of pushback against that in the 30s as a sort of concession to reality and like the sort of admirable conservatism. And it is interesting. Like my scrolling through Twitter these days, one is flooded with Nick Fuentes stuff. I've seen some clips of Fuentes like voicing his admiration for Stalin. Now, that being said, I'm not going to equate like Nick Fuentes with Losurdo, of course, and I'm not making that equation whatsoever. I would not equate Losurdo with even like Ahaz al-Din. They're interesting. I mean, somewhat interesting if one finds these kind of divisions like noteworthy, points of divergence between them. But there are points of contact, I would say, between the conservatism that is expressed by Stalinism as well as the nationalist far right. And to your point, I could have probably expanded on this a bit further in response to the earlier question, but also I'd like to tie it in with the question of like the family and these other forms. Marxists had predicted, as part of the overcoming of capitalism, the realization, the socialization of society, that these different institutional forms, the family, the market, religion, the state, would wither away eventually as the sort of class antagonisms of society were overcome. Losurdo views this as all just a folly and as having actually been damaging to the real efforts to build socialism over the last 100 years. And he tries to justify this by looking at, oh, well, the nation continues to be important under socialism. And his reasoning behind this is, well, there was the Sino-Soviet split between China and Russia. There was conflict between Cambodia and Vietnam, conflict between China and Vietnam. All these things that Marx, of course, and Lenin would have seen as just like, it would have horrified them, the idea that nominally socialist regimes would be at each other's throats over sort of along national lines. For Losurdo, he instead has to revise Marx's theory to say that no, the nation continues to be important even after the abolition or even after the seizing of power by socialist workers' movement.
I guess the follow-up to this then is to follow what I see as a kind of conservative thread in Losurdo's work. And that maybe brings us to the question of the Frankfurt School and postmodernism, post-structuralism more generally as being targets within the broader ambit of Western Marxism. And my question would it be right to say that the Frankfurt School becomes a the most notable target among them, as a kind of point of fixation for somebody like Losurdo and the other neo-Marxists? I guess what I'm asking is it just a theory industry thing, or is there actually a deeper anxiety about what critical theory in particular represents? And one of the concerns that I have about it, once again, this is another right-wing talking point where the Frankfurt School is kind of positioned in that space that was often called cultural Bolshevism. So I wonder if any of that sort of bleeds over.
Craig, let's use the original term here. It wasn't cultural Bolshevism. It was Judeo-Bolshevismus. Let's not give the people pushing
they used both cultural Bolshevism, Judeo-Bolshevismus. Like they were both used, but yeah, that was always the culture in question was always Judaic.
In the end, it seems like maybe not just critical theory in the proper sense, but also postmodernism, post-structuralism as being these sort of theoretical centers where discussions of other types of oppression and other types of struggle are cultivated. And then those things get cast as a kind of alien force to Marxism in the definitive sense. And how do you read that connection as it's playing out in Losurdo's work?
They are certainly postmodernism, post-structuralism, Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. These are all theoretical boogeymen that are taken up by, of course, neo-Stalinists from Losurdo and his epigones like Rockhill, as well as ACP-style MAGA communists, to obviously figures of the far right who have this sort of, obviously anti-Semitic narrative about basically when world revolution failed, Gramsci and the Frankfurt School shifted their focus to culture, and they've had their sort of long march through the institutions, undermining family, faith, and whatnot, and patriotic duty. I would say, yeah, there is kind of an analogous thing that happens within neo-Stalinism. At the same time, like Losurdo there is a conservatism to it. I would perhaps distinguish a bit between his opposition to that and rather the right wing's opposition to it. For him, it's rather that these figures deigned to criticize or not go along with the kind of mindless cheerleading for actually existing socialism and, the fact that it was able to defeat fascism and whatnot. So figures like Rockhill and probably Losurdo himself would have seen themselves as probably fellow travelers in the fight for the emancipation of sexual minorities and certainly of women's liberation in a way that the right wing would not. Nevertheless, I mean, there is like an extreme blind spot to them in terms of the history of socialist states in rolling back the measures of the October Revolution. To my knowledge, and again, like I did read through his Stalin book. He seemed to really gloss over any of the real depredations that occurred in terms of the family unit, trying to strengthen that, the fact that abortion was outlawed, the fact that it became much harder to get a divorce in the 30s. For them, for Stalinists, usually there's a kind of, again, post festum rationalization where they say, well, they had to prepare for the fascist threat. They had to, and the same thing goes with like forced industrialization, forced collectivization. This was all like an unfortunate but necessary response to the looming threat of fascism. But yeah, I mean, there is like, I would say there is a kind of common conspiratorial, like even if the reasons for opposing Frankfurt School critical theory and postmodernism, post-structuralism are different, there is a kind of common conspiratorial mindset I would see between both right-wing figures for whom, like Marcuse is the great evil behind the new left and behind repressive tolerance or whatever. Like the Stalinists also have this kind of, and really like this is apotheosized in like the work of Rockhill, which is just this kind of really gossipy, like, was the CIA funding X or Y theorist? Were they bankroll? Were they the ones who invited Foucault to give a series of talks in California? Was Marcuse working for a CIA cutout? It's true. I mean, there were like certainly, and I'm not going to like deny history. I mean, there were some like connections, but again, the CIA cast a huge net. And in fact, like Stalinist regimes encouraged, especially during World War II, encouraged their adherents to join like the US State Department, different agencies, as part of the sort of popular front against fascism. I mean, again, that was on direct orders from Moscow. So obviously that some of them continued in it after the Cold War had sort of taken effect. And I guess that's what a figure like Rockhill or Losurdo would object to. But yeah, it's all for both right wingers who demonize the Frankfurt School and postmodernism, as well as like Stalinists who do it. There's this kind of conspiracy laden, just I would say paranoia about these connections.
Well, I'm just looking at who funds Villanova University right now.
I thought it was going to be the same thing.
Like, it's the only Augustinian Catholic university in the nation. So I assume the forces of popery are behind this attempt to divide the left by promoting Losurdo's work here. That's basically the style of argument, as you've said. But there is something more thorough and methodological in this. It's still, I think you demonstrate that it has its problems. And so, why am I being so nice? Sometimes includes outright falsifications. I mean, we've spoken about Western Marxism as being its narratives kind of boogeyman, but I mean, I guess we wouldn't be acidhorizing if I didn't ask you about one other a good example of falsification here, which is the accusation levels against Nietzsche. And this isn't us to say that Nietzsche is actually secretly more Marxist than Marx, more communist than communist, but there are some times which Losurdo is just more or less using outright falsification, I guess. I mean, I think the best example is the example of Nietzsche's supposed overjoy at the disappearance of the Paris Commune.
Yeah, again, there is one letter where he, there was a false report in the press that Nietzsche, who was a great lover of culture and of art, of course, he read that the communards had burnt down the Louvre, which, of course, even then, even in the 1870s, housed a vast collection of art. And he was distraught over this. Even then, like, if you could, like, because Losurdo clips the letter, just cuts it short. Nietzsche says in the line that immediately follows that, in this private letter, that he could not bring himself to sort of cast aspersions upon these figures. He felt that they were kind of victims of this age, this fallen age. But just generally speaking, to try and use his reaction to the Paris Commune and to the spurious report as kind of the only lens through which one can adequately appreciate and understand the birth of tragedy, a work that he had begun 2 years before the Paris Commune even formed, is far-fetched in the extreme. Yeah, so Losurdo, again, like he has, he's really taking a page from the late Lukács, trying to expand and in some respects correct certain parts of Lukács's destruction of reason. Lukács, of course, famously read Nietzsche as a kind of proto-fascist philosopher, a philosopher of the Third Reich, avant la lettre. And Losurdo corrects him to say that no, he's more a reflection of Imperial Germany. He's a philosopher of the Second Reich. And Losurdo, to his credit, he is sensitive to some of the shifts that go on within, because obviously, like, Nietzsche had several different phases. People will disagree over what those exactly were. But Losurdo does trace those out. But throughout, he has just this dreadfully literal way of reading a figure who was known for aphorism and for metaphor and for provocation. I mean, I'm not going to claim, and obviously you wouldn't as well, you wouldn't either, that Nietzsche was this, fire-breathing revolutionary figure. In fact, I would say that he's really not that political at all. Of course, that cuts against the contention that Losurdo has had and that others have made sort of on the basis of Losurdo's argument that he is this philosopher totus politicus, that because he expands his sort of political objection to egalitarianism to the realm of like physics, that he's somehow more political figure than even Marx. Again, to me, this is a completely fanciful contention. He was an aesthete who never belonged to a political organization in his life. Marx, of course, from the middle of the 1840s to the very end of his life, was integrally involved in organizing an international political organization of the working class, writing papers, contributing to abolitionist papers in New York, writing, for the workers' press throughout Europe, and, corresponding with any number of revolutionaries in different in different countries. I would say, obviously, and again, I'm not a Nietzschean Marxist. I understand that those exist, and they have existed. Frankly, they've existed since the early 20th century. There were a number of Bolsheviks who were quite clearly inspired by Nietzsche. Figures like Bazarov, figures like Lunacharsky, even somebody who was fairly critical of Nietzsche, like Franz Mehring, gave an appreciative nod in the direction of Nietzsche in terms of like he saw young people's enthusiasm for the works of Nietzsche as kind of being a kind of gateway drug for socialism. So I'm not going to make that contention, but I would say that there are conceptual overlaps between certain things within Marx and within Nietzsche. There's a stress on the idea of overcoming, Aufhebung, and self-overcoming within Nietzsche, which is common to Marx and Nietzsche. Of course, Nietzsche, I would say, individualized it. For him, it was more a problem of the self overcoming, like the self being an individual, whereas the self overcoming in Marx is more of a collective social process. But still, like this idea of becoming, this stress on the sort of transience of existence and the fact that we can remake reality is common to them. They spurned ontology in favor of becoming. And also the other thing is that they also were strong critics of moralizing strains of socialism. And in fact, like, you know, the forms of socialism with which Nietzsche was familiar, Proudhon, Eugen Doring, Wagner, who was basically a Proudhonian, at least in 1848, certainly. The forms of socialism that Nietzsche was really familiar with, that he kind of cut his teeth on critically, were those of first and foremost, Wagner, who was a revolutionary in 1848. Of course, he became a kind of reactionary anti-Semite, but in 1848, he was on the barricades. Proudhon, who was the main source of inspiration in terms of where Wagner got his socialism from. And then later, this anti-Semitic, very popular socialist figure named Eugen Doring of anti-Doring fame. So Nietzsche never dedicated an entire book to tearing Doring down the way that Engels did, but was quite critical of the moralizing tendencies within Doring's arguments. And the stress on egalitarianism, which, again, this is a very common misconception. Marx, though one might claim that there are moralistic overtones, a sense of outrage embedded within his kind of impassioned pleas. He understood himself to be transcribing the sort of necessity, the historical necessity of the transformation of society without recourse to moral precepts. And so a lot of the criticisms that Nietzsche leveled against the socialists of his day as kind of secularized Christians, as based in ressentiment and just petty jealousy at the excellence of others, these kinds of criticisms don't work when it comes to Marxian socialism. And in fact, Marx himself was quite critical of appeals to justice and equality, such as were made by figures like Proudhon, Doring, and a range of other figures.
I guess one last thing to round off on is one other strand you pick up in Losurdo's work that I think very much ties into this. In some ways, you say revising of Marx, a kind of even going as far as to revise Lenin in favor of the post-Lenin Soviet project. Although I don't think Khrushchev necessarily counts in that post-Lenin Soviet project. I mean, also just thinking about Nietzsche and the interaction of Marxism. I mean, the first text I ever read from a Marxist that wasn't the Communist Manifesto was Trotsky's On the Philosophy of the Superman. But, you know, he also criticized the Soviet Union from his armchair in Mexico. And, we all remember what happened to Comrade Trotsky. And I think Losurdo is probably using his pen. He's like a nice pick-shaped pen or something, dipping it in ink. Because there's definitely the bidinal sight of enjoyment there that, oh yes, one day, yeah, we hold the guns and we'll use them. But just talking about Losurdo's, I mean, general, as you say, as you write in the piece, his anti-utopian tendency. What does this really say about his thought that is anti-utopian, to the extent that, it eliminates, I guess, even what some ostensibly, arguably, Stalinist thinkers would include? So I'm thinking about someone like Ernst Bloch, he's got the cold stream and the warm stream. For Losurdo, it's just cold piss all the way down. How do we talk about this, an anti-utopian Marxism? How do we even understand that? So it just become the idea that actually that we're not going to the good place that is no place. We're going to the good place, which is over there. And come over. And if you don't like it, then, well, I hope Big Daddy Joe will sort you out. I noticed did he even live in the Soviet Union? I noticed he had plenty of opportunities to. I don't know. Maybe he thought he was better as a ring girl for the Soviet bloc. But I just want to ask about his anti-utopian strand.
He visited the PRC several times. So he went to China in the 70s. And I guess that made a big impression on him. But yeah, so to circle back to the point about utopianism and anti-utopianism, of course, obviously, one of the richest epithets within the Marxian, vocabulary is to accuse one of utopianism. I would claim that there's an historical objection to utopianism, but it often misconstrues Marx's and Engels and the other Marxists' actual stance on the historical utopian socialists, which is actually quite appreciative. They understood the utopian socialists, by whom they meant figures like a sort of more political precursor being Gracchus Babeuf, of course, but the big three that Marx and Engels really key in on, of course, are Henri Saint-Simon, Charles Fourier, and Robert Owen, who was an English communist. While, of course, they understood them to be limited in terms of their their proposals for pocket editions of the New Jerusalem, their efforts to sort of forge these ideal communities on the fringes, often at the fringes of capitalism, on the Western frontier, in fact, in America, which is where Robert Owen set up a New Harmony, for example. Marx and Engels were quite appreciative of these efforts. They just saw them as misguided and not recognizing the real historical basis on which society as a whole could be transformed in accordance with the principles that they only forecast as communitarian guidelines that could be adopted within a sort of enclosed ideal city, and that the various utopians believed would then just spread naturally to the rest of society. So, of course, Marx and Engels were quite critical of them, but really they were also at the same time quite appreciative. They just believed that they didn't recognize the historical basis of communism, which was the proletarian socialist movement in Europe and throughout the nascently industrializing world. So what Losurdo does with this, of course, is that he identifies, he views, he recognizes that there is this historic critique of utopianism within Marx and Engels' work, but he then tries to apply that back to Marx and Engels themselves, saying that they didn't quite purge their own thought of these utopian tendencies that were inherited from figures like Saint-Simon and Owen, who all believed in the withering away of the state, in the realization of society, in a society that would be freed of exchange, in which the institutions of the family, the market, the nation would have ceased to exist. What's interesting, philosophically, is that when various other works, especially the book on class struggle, identifies this as a kind of residual Fichteanism. So I understand you guys did an episode with Gottlieb, Gabe Gottlieb on Fichte. So Fichte, of course, is a very interesting figure who went through several phases, including a sort of initial phase of enthusiasm for the French Revolution, and later a sort of German nationalist phase, repulsing Napoleon. And Losurdo wrote several books on Fichte, which have not been translated. But what he does with this in comparing Marx to kind of Fichtean is he believed that Marx had succumbed to what he calls the ideology of practice, the belief that just through the wonders of social practice, we could practically transform all of these congealed institutions that have been, passed down to us from history. So institutions such as the family, the market, the state, the nation, religion, etc. So he borrows from the later Lukács. Lukács wrote this trilogy toward the end of his life called The Ontology of Social Being, where he believed that he wanted to sort of grant a kind of independence and a sturdiness to the ontological claims of different institutions. And Losurdo thought that Marx, Engels, and Lenin, and various others who followed in their footsteps, namely the Western Marxists, who he believed seized on the most messianic aspects of Marx, Engels, and Lenin's works, that they were robbing them of their ontological independence. They weren't granting them their due as their actual social being. And in fact, the line from Fichte that Losurdo appeals to is that Fichte believed that the French Revolution was putting an end to things in themselves. This sort of noumena that Kant had talked about, the Ding an sich. So these noumenal institutions that I guess are impervious to social transformation in the sense that ever doing away with them. That's his alibi for why they continue to exist within putatively socialist states. That's why the family continues to be a bedrock of society in present-day China. That's why national feeling continues to be very important in Cuba and Vietnam and China and all the different actually existing socialist states. So it's this very, I would say, circuitous justification of just the course that history has taken.
I mean, that Fichte invocation that you say that Losurdo, if he's arguing that there's a kind of numinous factor to certain institutions, I mean, given that the noumena for Kant, for listeners, that the function of the noumena in Kant is to be a limit concept. It's thinkable, but it's not knowable. And so Kant's use of noumena is to say that if you try to know it, it's beyond our experience. If you try to know it, you end up in these interminable contradictions, which go beyond the limits of what we can possibly know. And so what Kant is trying to do with that is to reorient the way we ask questions in order to generate knowledge. And if you want to transpose that into the context of Stalinism, there's no other way I can really describe it as Losurdo saying, stop asking questions. You cannot bring the Kantian noumena in without saying, shut up, stop asking questions. And I think he has to write something like this, but because without the force of Soviet or Dengist weaponry behind him, he can't stop us.
I mean, it's just interesting, too, that proletarian struggle somehow isn't in the noumenal or archetypal category. But yeah, so Ross, thanks again for the series of articles that you've provided to us. And basically everyone out there, we're going to have links to all of that in the show notes. And in just a minute, we're going to pivot to a sort of offline green room discussion with Ross, just to talk about some of the publishing beefs in the world of Losurdo. And I don't know, maybe how it has impacted the world of Acid Horizon. But one of the things that I found most interesting, after reading the whole series of essays, and the big question that comes up for me is, as you stress in the articles, 1917 to 1923 was the workers' movement's greatest success in history, arguably, but also its greatest failure because the revolution, in many respects, did not go beyond Russia. And so how does Losurdo navigate around the impulse towards a critical reflection on that exactly, especially given that a lot of his exponents, whether it be the Frankfurt School, Deleuze and Guattari and Foucault and everyone else, have done much on that topic. And instead, he uses them as kind of a scapegoat, whether that's them as themselves or attacking the root, which in many ways I see as Nietzsche and Nietzsche's work. But does Losurdo himself have any sort of point of reflection on the failure and any way to sort of navigate away from the possibility of that failure in a successive try at socialism in one country?
Yeah, so I mean, he does, of course, reflect on the fact that the world revolution that was anticipated by Marxists from Lenin to Trotsky to even Stalin, I would say, did not come to pass. For him, though, what this ends up being is just a chance to say, well, no, in fact, it was never really in the cards. We have to revise our theories and adapt it to what did, in fact, end up taking place. And for him, he tries to reconceptualize the entire history of the socialist movement as a kind of open-ended learning process, a kind of series of trial and error experimentations and throwing everything at the wall. And what ends up sticking ends up being the only thing that was ever really, truly possible. So there's really a kind of shrinking of the category of possibility throughout history, the idea that alternative courses might have presented themselves. And really, for him, 1917 to 1923 only represents a kind of subjective crisis within the international workers' movement that then led to what he said was a correct pivot to the project of building socialism in isolation along the periphery of capitalism. Of course, for him, that also entailed support for various national liberation movements, though, of course, I would argue that the Soviet Union's actual track record in that respect was rather checkered. Of course, they did supply arms to various national liberation projects, but some of these national liberation projects, there are things that they considered to be, liberatory national projects, such as the Foundation of Israel, that they then armed to the teeth and, in fact, created the Israeli Air Force in 1948. It's a checkered past. I would argue.
Well, may I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to intervene because, clearly he's moving the goalposts while things are sticking to the wall. So when that aspect is pointed out from a Marxist standpoint, how does he respond to such a criticism? Naming the family, for example, as the sort of eternal feature of human society, or a particular image of the family, or the nation, as we understand it in modernity.
Yeah, so he does this quite a bit in the Stalin book, and he invokes different other authorities along the way to kind of, again, I guess, underwrite theoretically the point that he was trying to make of, the enduring quality, the persistence of the family, the market, the nation, etc. For Losurdo, Stalin represented a sort of recognition of reality, whereas the kind of like fever dream of the early revolutionary years and the first 15 years of the USSR's existence, even after Trotsky was expelled and after there was a kind of political involutions within the Soviet bureaucracy, it was still it represented a flowering of these different sort of utopian experiments. Again, I would highly recommend, there's a great book by Richard Stites called Revolutionary Dreams, if you want to hear about really like the limits of the utopian imagination within the first 15 years of the Soviet Union. But for Losurdo, of course, Stalin represented a kind of sober recognition of the reality of the situation, which was, in his view, that perhaps these institutions never will fade. Perhaps the family is a sort of perennial feature of human existence that can never be practically overcome. Same goes with the state. No society no mode of production could ever be imagined in which political power would not loom over us and superintend our daily affairs. So for him, like figures like Stalin, and this is why he prefers actually he would prefer Stalin to the Mao of the Cultural Revolution. He admires certain aspects of Mao, but he views Mao as having succumbed to these kinds of messianic impulses as well, and creating a lot of chaos within China during the Cultural Revolution. That's why he also appreciates somebody like Deng as like kind of like revolutionaries kind of coming to their senses and understanding the long, slow, patient project of building counter-hegemony against imperialism. So he views it as a concession to reality, such that Marx, Engels, and Lenin and others could never, or perhaps imprudently imagined, could have been transformed, but in fact was beyond the scope of our ability to change.
Well, Ross, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to keep it down link below. If you want to read Ross's trilogy of articles, they are all on New International, not New International List, newintermag.com. We'll link them down below. Ross, are you currently working on anything else at the moment? Where can people find you if they want to keep up your work?
So I'm employed. I'm a history teacher, New York City Department of Education. So when I'm not teaching high schoolers, I try to keep myself busy. I organize with the Independent Labor Club of New York, which is a mostly national organization at this point, though we do have comrades in Australia. In terms of writing projects, I've written for Situations, which is kind of a situationist journal, Project of the Radical Imagination, Brooklyn Rail. I've written a couple pieces for Dataside, which is like kind of a critical theory music journal. And I write different things for architectural publications. So Architectural Review, New York Review of Architecture. In fact, I assume you guys know Owen Hatherley from Repeater.
Yep.
I just finished, I finished a very laudatory review of his book on the alienation effect, which I don't know if you've had the chance to read it, but it's basically about how different Central European emigres to Britain changed its visual culture and even the way that art history was written. It's really like everything Owen writes. It's a pleasure to read. And again, like considering its readability, it's quite rigorous. Like he really like delved into the archives, talks about how Penguin Press featured the work, the aesthetics of all these like Central European designers and art historians who contributed to some of its bestsellers. But yeah, so I've got a review of his book coming out, which I'm looking forward to. I'm writing a piece on the concept of abstract time, which is something that some Marxists have written about. Moise Bastone, who kind of writes in the vein of the Frankfurt School and critical theory. He wrote a book. I studied with him at University of Chicago, but he was taking up stuff from different figures, from E.P. Thompson, who wrote a great essay on time discipline, and from Lewis Mumford, whose Technics and Civilization was very, very important text to like Marcuse and to De Boer and others. I'm trying to sort of mesh that with this kind of forgotten J.G. Ballard short story, Chronopolis, which is about a society in which timekeeping has been outlawed. So that's what I've got going right now. But yeah, I'm glad to finally have this Losurdo trilogy out of the way. It's like I was saying to the guys from the Intifada, this has been kind of a long time in the making, because I actually interviewed Losurdo back in 2012. And so I kept seeing his work gaining in popularity, and especially as like he became better known in different quarters of the internet, the sort of neo-Stalinist revival, which again, I did not see coming. Maybe it was just a function of my politicization at an earlier moment, like coming up in the anti-war years. Stalinism, like it's still like, if you were going to encounter that, it was in a more like purely Maoist form that was kind of spearheading. You didn't get a lot of the enthusiasm for China that you see in the last like 10 years. But yeah, so as he's gained in popularity, and these aspects of his work have come to the fore, and he's become kind of a leading light of these different neo-Stalinist configurations, neo-Marxist-Leninist, I felt like I had to get it out of my system, finally, hopefully deal the coup de grace to what I consider to be a very shoddy career of scholarship and misleading.
And we thank you for your service. And of course, listeners, if you want to read some of Domenico Losurdo books, you can actually get most of them out now from our friends over at the presses, libgen.org and anasarchive.com publishing. It's free. It's really awesome that they put these stuff out for free. And so it really does tend, we want to foster a culture of debate and openness on Acid Horizon. So we want to make sure everyone gets access to the books whenever they want them. So go to anasarchive.org, go to libgen, get yourself some Losurdo, and hopefully we've given you some sort of conceptual methodologies to maybe approach his work, not be led into too many noumenal weeds by it. But Ross, thank you for joining us. And we're going to go to behind the paywall now for a little bit of technical materialist analysis of how this stuff ends up getting out into the circuit. Now we'll see you all next time. So, okay, we're now behind the paywall, so now we can talk about sort of that rather than doing too much of a Losurdo aspect and looking at sort of
Find the link to our Patreon account in the show notes below to continue the discussion with us. We will see you there.